Last week we introduced the book of Daniel, introduced what the main theme of this book of the Old Testament is. This book, which is a prophetic book, but also a narrative book. It tells the story of God's people while in exile. What had happened, and as we'll see in the opening verses of this book, is that God's people in Judah were taken away, where Judah was conquered by the Babylonians, as the prophets had continually warned, turn from your sin, turn back to God, or you will be brought into exile, you'll be conquered by another people, captured and led away, and that is exactly what happened. But the question here is, now that that has happened, now that God's people do not live in a land that they control, live in a land where they are free to do whatever and pray to God however they want, how can they be faithful when they are experiencing that exile? And that is the question for us as well. How are we to remain faithful to God as we live and work in a land that is not explicitly fearing and following Yahweh? How are you to be faithful in your work, in your study, in your family, in your relationships? What does that faithfulness look like day by day? And I'll remind you again that theme we talked about that is going to run through every passage. That in Daniel we see that kingdoms rise and kingdoms fall. So we must remain faithful to the everlasting and enduring kingdom of God through every adversity. Kingdoms rise and kingdoms fall, but we are called to remain faithful to the everlasting kingdom of God through every adversity. And we will see right from the beginning what some of those adversities look like here in Daniel chapter 1. In the third year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand with some of the vessels of the house of God, and he brought them to the land of Shinar, to the house of his God, and placed the vessels in the treasury of his God. The king commanded Ashpenaz, his chief eunuch, to bring some of the people of Israel, both of the royal family and of the nobility, youths without blemish, of good appearance and skillful in all wisdom, endowed with knowledge, understanding, learning, competent to stand in the king's palace, and to teach them the literature and language of the Chaldeans. The king assigned them a daily portion of the food, and the king ate, and of the wine that he drank. They were to be educated for 3 years, and at the end of that time they were to stand before the king. Among these were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah of the tribe of Judah. And the chief of the eunuchs gave them names. Daniel he called Belteshazzar, Hananiah he called Shadrach, Mishael he called Meshach, and Azariah he called Abednego. But Daniel resolved that he would not defile himself with the king's food, or with the wine that he drank. Therefore he asked the chief of the eunuchs to allow him not to defile himself. And God gave Daniel favor and compassion in the sight of the chief of the eunuchs. And the chief of the eunuchs said to Daniel, I fear my lord the king, who assigned your food and your drink. For why should he see that you are in worse condition than the youths who are of your own age? So you would endanger my head with the king. And Daniel said to the steward, whom the chief of the eunuchs had assigned over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, test your servants for 10 days. Let us be given vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then let our appearance and the appearance of the youths who eat the king's food be observed by you, and deal with your servants according to what you see. So he listened to them in this matter, tested them for 10 days. At the end of 10 days, it was seen that they were in better appearance and fatter in flesh than all the youths who ate the king's food. So the steward took away their food and wine they were to drink and gave them vegetables. As for these 4 youths, God gave them learning, skill in all literature and wisdom. Daniel had understanding in all visions and dreams. At the end of the time when the king had commanded they should be brought in, the chief of the eunuchs brought them in before Nebuchadnezzar, and the king spoke with them. And among all of them none was found like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Therefore they stood before the king. And in every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king inquired of them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters that were in all his kingdom. And Daniel was there until the first year of King Cyrus. This is the word of the Lord. I acknowledge in the past week seeing the images that have been coming out of the Palisades fire and the other fires that are raging in the Los Angeles area. It's just quite horrifying. It's otherworldly. And it's not the first time we've seen images like this, where it looks as if, as some have said, a portal to hell itself has opened up. Just the orange and red of the night just engulfed by smoke and ash. It seems as if that whole area is, as some might say, God-forsaken. A place completely just overtaken and abandoned by God's presence is what it feels like when you see that kind of destruction and loss and pain and tragedy. And we put words to that because when tragedies like that, of that degree, of that extreme, come and they seem so random and they seem so uncontrollable and unable for us to comprehend, it is hard for us to find the answer to the question of where is God now? Where is God in that experience? And if you've experienced great loss or terror, the question of where God was likely comes to your mind. Where is God in disaster and in pain and in horror? That is the question, I think, for many of the Jews here as Jerusalem is brought low. Read the book of Lamentations, which comes right before these events, and you will hear that kind of question. That pain, that sorrow, that lament of God's people. God, where are you in the midst of this? When God's people have been defeated and his temple has been reduced to rubble, where is God in that time? And there, as God's people are taken to a new land, are they then going to have to serve a new God? Who then is the God of Babylon? Maybe the God of Babylon will watch over them and protect them. This text, I think, proves to us in very clear detail who is the God of Babylon. Who is the God still working in the face of tragedy? And I'll tell you, we will see that truly Yahweh is still the God in Babylon. He is the true one reigning and working. Even in the face of tragedy, even in loss, God is still God there. So we must, in our tragedy, in our exile, in our pain, in our own personal Babylon, we must all know who the true God of Babylon is. We must seek to see how we might live by the true God of Babylon, and also see what success in his name looks like. How we must know, live by, and succeed by our true God. The first 7 verses, I think, put this question for us. Who is the God of Babylon? Because it begins, God's people are invaded, they're captured, they're taken away, and then they're being reconditioned, trained to become Babylonian. And what God, what deity is at work here? Verse 1 says, in the 3rd year of the reign of King Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand with some of the vessels of the house of God. And he brought them to the land of Shinar, to the house of his God, and placed in the vessels of the treasury of his God. The temple has been plundered. The objects that have been used for the worship of Yahweh are taken away and put into a temple of another God. Think to the book of 1 Samuel when the ark was captured and taken away and put in the temple of another God. It's as if to say, hey, this God is not as great as our God. That's what the Babylonians would be saying. And what makes this worse is that not only are the objects of the sacred temple of Yahweh treated like trophies of war and spoil of war, so are these young teenage men treated like trophies as well. These young teens, that's the age that these men of Daniel and Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, they would have been probably somewhere between the ages of 12 to 15 or so. This young age. They were of noble line. They were important in Judah at the time. And they're brought along to be trophies in the court of the king. As these wise, good men that were going to then be taught to be Babylonian, how to speak like Babylonian men, and given names of Babylonians. Among these were Daniel, Mishael, Azariah, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, and the chief eunuchs gave them names. Daniel he called Belteshazzar. Hananiah he called Shadrach. Mishael he called Meshach. And Azariah he called Abednego. They come to serve the court of the king. When it talks about their attractiveness being important, back then they kind of have a different view of intelligence and attractiveness. I think we kind of view them as opposed to each other. Like we think of like nerdy people being very low in fashion sense and maybe even just like not conventionally attractive, and that's what makes them great. They put all their energy into being smart and attractive people. You wonder, do they really have anything going on inside? The Babylonians weren't quite like that. They were still shallow, but shallow in a different way than we are. They saw an attractive person and be like, well, they must be smart too. Still doesn't tell you anything. But they saw brains and brawn coming together, and that's what they sought to do with these young teens. Nebuchadnezzar wants to fully make them in his own image, though, to strip them of their Jewish identity, make sure they conform. They are given this whole re-education program, this readjustment, this conformity by taking away their names. Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, Azariah. These are the names of Elohim and Yahweh. These are names that contain God's name in them. And what names do they get instead? Names with Belteshazzar, Meshach, Shadrach, Abednego. These are names of Babylonian gods. They are trying to be marked as Babylonian people, even removing the name of the gods from them to Babylonian gods. So we have here, and then they're taught in the deep magical lore of Babylon and how to interpret. Essentially, they're to be really good at writing horoscopes for the local Babylonian newspaper, right? Like that was very important to the Babylonians. They are trying to become as Babylonian as possible. That's what they want from these men. And so the central question, as one commentator wrote, is this: how could these four famous young men have gained success in the pagan world without being tainted by it? Like, how can they succeed in this pagan court without becoming tainted by it? That's the question. And why we know they won't is because we need to understand actually who is the god of Babylon. Well, I just said they've been given these names of these Babylonian gods, but is it by the names of the Babylonian gods that they excel? No. It is interesting instead that the god of Babylon is not mentioned. What I mean by Nebuchadnezzar brings these vessels to his god. We don't get the name. The temple of the treasury of his God. We don't get the name. Why? Because that God's not real. He's not there. He is not he doesn't actually exist. These subtle little ways that God, as he writes these scriptures, mocking the Babylonians, even calling it the land of Shinar. Do you see that in verse 1 or verse 2 rather? The land of Shinar. That's an old name. It's like calling New York New Amsterdam. Like it is the name of the city before it was actually renamed. Shinar is the place where the Tower of Babel was. It's the same about location. And so it's calling it this great, beautiful city. One of the seven, if you ever played the Seven Wonders game, the Hanging Gardens of Babylon are in there, right? One of the ancient beauties of the ancient world was the kingdom of Babylon, the Ishtar Gate, the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. And the author of Daniel is just calling it, Shinar. Just as pointless as the Tower of Babel that was left incomplete, where God confused the languages, just the same, this is a fruitless endeavor. It will become nothing. There are no named gods. The city is given an old name because that is not what makes Babylon great. There is only one God of Babylon, and his name is Yahweh. And we see that as well in verse 2, that who actually conquers, or who lets Judah be conquered? Nebuchadnezzar is there with his army, but it says the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into the hand of Nebuchadnezzar. Yahweh is at work here. He is the one bringing these events about. Another one person wrote that Nebuchadnezzar was the axe that Yahweh used to chastise his people. Nebuchadnezzar is a tool in the hands of Yahweh. Does this make God an enemy of his people? I mean, does this maybe make his people more afraid? Does God go too far in his chastisement then? We can know that God goes even further, even against himself. For it is God's own Son who took on the greatest punishment and the greatest exile. Jesus himself shows us what we have been spared from. If you fear what the chastisement and punishment God brings, nothing is greater than what Jesus underwent at the cross itself. In the darkness of Calvary, God's power and his mercy was there in the most magnificent and impactful ways. That, yes, the darkness of the cross, as the land was shrouded in darkness, as the Son of God gave his last breath, God was still God there in that darkness. He's the God of the cross. He's the God of the empty tomb. So surely in our pain and our tragedy, and even in the tragedy of our own poor decisions that we bring on ourselves, God is still God there. In your own personal Babylon, God is still God there. And so with that comes a question for us. How will we live faithfully then? If we know that the world we live, the world we work in, the world we live with others in, for our neighbors, our coworkers, our fellow students, our family, that is not a separate sphere that God does not have reign over. God has reign over all spheres and all places. So how are we then to live faithfully, knowing that he is the one and true only God there? To put it this way, as we kind of move to what it means to really live by the true God of Babylon, are we living in a way that does confess that? Do we live in a way that knows, hey, there's one God here? Because these 4 Jewish teens are being called to give that up, to confess a different God. In these new names, in this new education, even by the food that they eat, they are being called to be reconditioned away, to turn their hearts from God. And I ask you, what ways are we being shaped? What gods would desire that we worship, rather? What diet plan, rather? What spiritual diet, put it that way, is put to us? What menu are we given? What shapes and forms us? What is trying to rename us away from the name of Christian? What would the world tell you? You have to consume this lest you starve. And it probably isn't food, but it probably is in the name of cultural acceptance and relevance. It's in the name of success and money and mobility upwards. It is in all the ways that we determine what makes us great, what makes us respectable. To the way we view our work as this nonstop thing without rest, not allowing a Sabbath day. That is a very backwards thing. The way we view our sexual relationships, whatever is most expedient and best for us, that's the way that the world would have us do. But to make different stands and say, no, I will rest from my labor. I will view my work differently. I won't move in together before we get married. To see these little subtle stances of saying, no, I'm not going to be renamed or reshaped by this in this way. To the world that might look so uptight, old-fashioned, get over it, it's not that big of a deal. No, God is still God over our lives and our work, of our relationships. So how then are we called to live by him? And we see in Daniel what that looks like. Daniel draws a line at food, which is interesting. There are a lot of kind of guesses why Daniel draws a line at food. Some people think it might be the kosher purity laws. Maybe they're being served a lot of pork, but we're not sure why the wine would be included as something that would defile him too. Others might guess that this food had been offered to idols, and that's why Daniel would have been defiled by it. And we see that in the New Testament too. This concern of what if food has been sacrificed to an idol? Does that corrupt you then too? I'm persuaded that this is actually simply a statement of who Daniel's relying on. It's a statement on how is Daniel going to live. It's a statement on who provides for Daniel. From whose hand does the daily bread come? So he asks for the simplest foods possible. When it says vegetables, keep in mind, the word there is really anything sown. So it could be lentils, peas, grains. It has variety, but there's really not much fat in that diet. it's not one that will make someone excel in their beauty and their strength the way a good bit of meat would in that time. You had very limited resources of what would make you strong and great, and just sticking to only these simple grains, peas, other root vegetables of things that are sown, will he succeed the same way? What Daniel is doing is not even just kind of putting things to a test. He is testifying to that God will sustain him and not Nebuchadnezzar. To take from the table of the king is to say, this king is the one who sustains me. But by eating otherwise is to say, Yahweh is who sustains me. For us to be in the world, but not of it, means finding in what ways we need to declare God is the one who sustained me. God, look, Daniel's not going on a full hunger strike here. He doesn't fully resist all things Babylonian. He receives the name, he takes the teaching, but draws a line on the food because he is trying to learn how to converse in a world where he's in exile and yet not hunger for it. How are we called to be able to be conversant in the world? We exist in this world. We understand the way the world thinks, but we should also not hunger for what the world promises, as if that will make us satisfied. As you can imagine the eye roll from the chief eunuch of, oh, here's another fundamentalist Jewish man, this Hebrew who wants to make everything a moral standard. Maybe if they weren't so concerned about food, they wouldn't have gotten conquered in the first place, he's thinking. What are the things that the culture wants for you to check at the door, to keep to yourself? We have freedom of religion here, but honestly, we all want people to have their own beliefs, but just don't tell me about them is kind of the culture that we have, right? That's the mindset of living things in exile. Hey, exist in the secular world, take on our practices, and keep things to yourself. It's a mindset that Daniel cannot fully take up. He's still going to work and act and operate, but there are certain areas where he'll say, no, I'm still living and being sustained by Yahweh. I'm not just going to shut up about my convictions so I don't cause trouble. May that never be. So he offers a test to say, for 10 days, let us be given vegetables to eat and water to drink, just the bare necessities here. Then let our appearance and the appearance of our youths who eat and drink the king's food be observed by you, and deal with your servants according to what you see. So we listened to them in that matter and tested them for 10 days. At the end of 10 days, it was seen that they were better in appearance and fatter in the flesh than all the youths who ate the king's food. So the steward who took away their food and the wine they were to drink gave them vegetables. Understand, Daniel respectfully draws the line here. He's not getting in his face and saying, you wicked, disgusting, vile Babylonian. He's got no place really to do that. But he's just saying, I'm going to honor my true God the way I will. Just give me this. And it's just this subtle, small way to say, hey, I'm different. And it is but in that his testimony is seen so magnificently. For us to consider what it means, where we need to draw the line, it doesn't mean withdrawing fully from our own Babylon, right? It doesn't mean for us to leave the world. No, we exist and work and continue in it. But just say, I'll do what you ask, but I'm going to hold to my convictions because I believe them, and I believe you will see that there is a goodness in the way that I'm living. It's not, I'm going to take my ball and go home. It's actually invitingly and apologetically throwing the ball around and inviting them in to see how my God is going. I believe my God is going to work in me actually not indulging in all the things you think I should. I'm going to have some reservations here, and I actually think that's going to bring some goodness. And I invite you to see that and to be witness to it. And what happens, the amazing thing that happens here, is God is vindicated. This is not about how Daniel, Mishael, Azariah, and Hananiah excel and exceed and become great. It is how God vindicates his name through his people. God's name is vindicated. Because when this started off, as another commentator wrote, what started off as an invasion of Yahweh's God space actually became a clever strategy to invade Marduk's own territory, the god of Babylon. That the false god, the empty god of Babylon, his territory gets invaded by Yahweh and his people in this strange Trojan horse kind of way. Because God is made clear in the health of these young Hebrew men. Now, you could read this and be like, well, see, the simple vegetarian diet is the healthier diet, and that's just like a simple scientific explanation of why they look better. And I prefer that this is actually a divine miracle of the Most High God, rather than having to want to give up my meatless, have meatless dishes. But the reason actually why I do think that this is significant God's work, because it says they're fatter in the flesh. Like, I I don't know how many of you guys are saying, hey, it's bulking season, boys, let's go get our lentils and beans. Right? That doesn't, let me get some more peas, right? That you're not going to bulk up on that. You need some good protein. They're not getting that from this diet. And God still makes them look fatter, bigger, and healthier, actually. God is making the statement of, hey, if you depend on Yahweh, not to say you're all going to look more attractive if you pray harder. Don't hear that. But it is a way in the context of a world that wants them to capitulate all faith in God, to say, no, I'm going to hold to my conviction that Yahweh is still God here. And God, by his work, shows them, no, I am still God of these people, even while they're in exile. And so, I want to then kind of flip that for us. Let's not think of this as this is how I get successful by drawing the line in all these ways, and then I'm going to get all the things I want. No, the success here is on God's terms. It's still a simple, clear statement of, I'm going to survive and I will thrive by God's provision. And I will retain and uphold my identity, my union with Christ, and not forsake that to fit in better, to have a better place. It is to uphold all things and glory to Christ in all ways, and not sacrifice things to the gods of mammon, the gods of greed, the gods of vanity, who do not have anything on the power of Yahweh. The gods of money and greed and vanity cannot bring you prosperity. They cannot give you joy. They cannot give you success, because they are nothing, and all things will fall apart in the end. Quote, in order to witness to their God in the Babylonian court, these men had to understand the cultural presuppositions of those around them, just as the Christian today must work hard at the religions and cultures amongst which he lives, if different thought worlds are ever to meet. They had to know the culture they were in, the presuppositions of the court of Babylon, but be able ever more then to give an account for what their viewpoint and what their morals will be. Again, this could easily be a sermon on, hey, if you stick to your Christian morals, God's going to give you a promotion. I'm sure those sermons have been written. That's not the point of this text, though. Consider that Daniel is not getting on the front page of Forbes' 10 most influential Hebrew executives for this. He's a captive still in exile. He's still in chains. He's forced into the Babylonian court, choosing to live on less. He's living on less than what the other courtiers are living on. That's not easy for Daniel. He's probably pretty hungry most of the time. Make no mistake, Daniel is doing great in terms of the rest of the Jewish people. Yeah, he's in a palace. Like, that's pretty good. He's not in slave labor here. He's in a room with the king, but he's still a captive, exiled teenage boy. By holding fast to what God commands, it's not a pretty situation. And for us, finding success by God's way, it might still be painful. It might still be difficult. But what God is aiming to do and succeeding to do is to use Daniel to bring the name of Yahweh into the court of Nebuchadnezzar. Where Nebuchadnezzar is trying to remove the name of Yahweh, Daniel and his friends, by their life and by their witness, are making God's name plain. Where is the God of the Jews now that the temple burns and Jerusalem is in ruins? Yahweh is speaking once again in Shinar. Where man's speech was corrupted and the Tower of Babel left unfinished and in rubble, God once again returned, calls and shapes. As men have returned to that plain to make a name for themselves and consider their empire great, rename young men of God, God is going to speak through the mouth of the prophet Daniel and say, I am the Lord God Most High, God of Israel and Lord even over the empire of Babylon. That is what God has come to do. And for us, succeeding by that is knowing that God's name is proclaimed in that way. Understand, apologetics can be simple. in the clear, subtle, and drawing of a definite line in the sand to say, I depend on my God. As simple as that. Saying that I'm not going to see my success and my hope on indulging in the way the world calls on us, but instead depending on him. And so in that we are called to remember that God, in our own personal Babylons and our own exiles, is still at work. He is still God. He's still judge. He is still ruler. And those who bring us harm will be brought low, and those who cheat will have to pay back. That God, yes, is still God in your workplace. And yes, God is still God in your tragedy. That if he is bringing you in it, he will surely bring you through it and show his power and his grace all the more. Because he is not throwing you to the mercy of equally powerful gods. He is carrying you through a situation where you will know his power all the more. You will be brought through. You will be taken through. You will be healed. Because he heals, he reigns, he restores in all things. Because we see that again in the cross of Jesus. That Jesus experienced exile, he experienced shame, he experienced pain, all to the end to which, when he cried, it is finished, and a pagan Roman looked on and said, truly this was the Son of God. It is in his death, in the darkness, the darkest moment in human history, that God showed his power and his grace. And so consider how in all of our successes, in all of our tragedies, and in all of our mundane lives, we might as well lift high the name of Christ and his power and his provision in all ways. Let us pray to him now.